Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Welcome to Monday Monsters on the Scary Stories NYC channel. I'm Dr. Death. We've got an extra long show today featuring our best stories of the month, plus this all new and terrifying Dogman story that I have decided we shall call
Dogman versus the Red Sasquatch. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story for you about the Dogman showing up at the most unexpected moment. It was the only time in my life when I ever saw something I am certain was a cryptid. And it was also the only night I ever saw two cryptids. Let me go back to the beginning so you'll understand what I'm trying to tell you. Where and when I grew up in Pennsylvania in the 1970s and 1980s, we had a lot of local beliefs involving Bigfoot. The big dark ones were supposed to be more friendly and shy toward humans. The red Sasquatch were supposed to be the more evil ones. The stories told about them I can't even repeat here. They're even alleged to have had humans on their diet. All the boys in my grade at school shared stories they had heard from relatives and friends about the two basic types of Sasquatch alleged to live in our area. There were stories of the black ones, sometimes taking food but leaving odd tokens in return. There were stories of the red ones stealing food far more forcefully. We had beliefs about their relative height and demeanor, with the black ones being taller but the red ones being more feared in the forest. We had beliefs on top of beliefs on top of beliefs, and it didn't matter to any of us that we had no actual evidence to support these beliefs. We were imbibing in belief. And that can be intoxicating and disorienting. Nothing can blind your vision or block your hearing faster or harder than preconceived beliefs. Looking at the world through a belief system is like looking at the world through your phone while playing Pokemon Go. Those monsters aren't really standing in the alley outside the local McDonald's, you know. Only an elaborate belief system is there. As author Robert Anton Wilson pointed out, the initials of belief system are BS, but you don't have to listen to him or me because all beliefs, eventually, are shattered and crash to the ground in the face of reality. This is a story about how the Dogman did just such a thing to me and my friends. It's funny how we had all these beliefs about Bigfoot and monsters that we took for granted. All these stories we've been told by our fathers and older brothers, and we never questioned any of it. A big part of that mythos, however, involved the belief, no, the absolute conviction, that werewolves existed only in movies and scary bedtime stories. So the way it went down was, I was with my friend we can call George, and my other friend we can call Foggy. Foggy was the leader of our trio. We always ended up doing what he thought would be fun. I was really only friends with him for 2 years, but he was the boss during that period of time. We were in the woods outside our little town one day. I don't remember what we were doing, but we were probably up to no good. George signaled for me and Fogg to shut up, and he pointed out something weird in the trees off in the distance. Fogg understood what it was immediately, and he ducked behind a tree and hid. I did the same, even though I hadn't yet grasped the meaning of what my eyes had seen. All I knew was it was something colored like a fox, like a red fox. From the glimpse I had gotten, I wasn't yet able to place distance or size of the thing, and I was mostly watching Fogg and George to try to figure out from their reactions what exactly was going on. Fog started giving silent hand signals that I didn't understand in the least. Then he ran off to our right as I watched, befuddled. George came up behind me and pushed me in Fog's direction, and all three of us ran a distance until Fog chose a stopping place behind a large boulder. With a stick, Fog started drawing something in the dirt. There was an X, and there were 3 circles. He pointed to the X, then pointed over the rock, back toward whatever it was that we had initially seen. He pointed at the circles one at a time, then at each of us. So we were the circles, and the X was that red thing out there somewhere. Fog drew lines from the circles indicating that he was going to try to head the X off from the left, while George should attempt the same from the right, and I should head up directly toward it from behind. I would be coming up behind it assuming it was facing away from us. I didn't like the plan, because I had no idea what I was supposed to be walking up behind. But the 2 of them ran off, presumably following their parts of the battle plan. I knew I was going to do what Fog asked, so I ran off straight up the middle of the 2 divergent paths my friends had taken. At first, I jogged, as I needed to make sure the other 2 didn't get too far ahead of me. I tried to be quiet, but I also tried to make up time. I couldn't see the thing in front of me anymore until a flash of orangey red caught my attention. From that point onward, I made more of an effort to hide myself from being seen or heard. I had no idea what I was supposed to do when I finally caught up with whatever it was. I was visualizing a red squirrel, or maybe a fox, as I had said earlier. I came around a patch of trees and looked up, and suddenly I could get a pretty clear view of this thing I was walking after. It was facing away from me, but I could see it was standing up, and it was so large that I dove behind a tree and tried not to faint. This went from a squirrel hunt to something truly terrible, because there was nothing that large, that furry, or that red in those woods, except for the legendary red Sasquatch. My heart went from 0 to 90 instantly. I leaned against the tree and slid to the ground. It was easier to sit than stand because my knees had gone weak. I was feeling dizzy and seeing spots in front of my eyes. I leaned back against the tree, closed my eyes, and tried to focus on nothing but breathing. Even with my eyes shut, the entire world spun around me. It was a very unpleasant moment, and I couldn't really pay attention to anything outside myself until I'd gotten through the feeling that I needed to faint. My discomfort grew slightly less, but my heart didn't slow down at all. I was trailing a red Sasquatch, the most dangerous kind, and I wasn't out of danger yet by a long shot. As I got well enough to remember Fog and George, I heard screaming in the woods. I heard each of them scream like a stereo recording. George and Fog, they were both in the direction of the red thing, but on either sides of me. I don't care if you think I'm a coward, but I ran directly home. When I got there, I found a message on my family's answering machine from Fog saying to call him back. I wondered if that was from before we went out, or if it meant he had survived his encounter with the red Sasquatch. I also wondered if it meant George hadn't survived, that is. So I called Fog on the phone and he picked up on the first ring. He was very happy I was okay, and I was glad he was too. George was with him and they told me to come over to Fog's place so we could all share our stories. Mine was nothing compared to theirs. Actually, The first parts of their stories were identical to mine, just walking through the woods and barely making the thing out in the distance. But both George and Fogg managed to pass the creature and get slightly in front of it as it came through a path between the trees. They both saw each other, then saw the creature, essentially simultaneously. "And that's when you screamed?" I asked. They were insulted by this concept. Why would they scream when they caught up with an animal they had been trailing? What would be so surprising about finding what you were looking for? They both called me stupid in various ways, and I was still no closer to understanding what had happened. George looked at me and said, "It was a red Sasquatch. It was like 6 feet tall or so, and it had a face like a mix between an ape and a man." "Yeah, but including the ugliest parts of both," added Fogg, with George agreeing. "That was the ugliest thing I ever saw." Both of them went into detail about how disagreeable the appearance and stench of this creature was, yet insisted that was not at all what had caused them to scream. So what did then? An equally reddish-brown, 8-foot tall, evil-looking giant dog that ran on its hind legs. Okay, that stopped the conversation. "So, you're saying you saw a werewolf?" I asked. Then, I broke out laughing. I asked them to tell me the real story, but they kept insisting this was what actually happened. While they watched the red Sasquatch approaching from one direction, out of nowhere, at lightning speed, came the largest dog either of them had ever seen. But it was running on its hind legs like a man. George said the Dogman leaped into the direction of the ape man, and that was all he could take. He ran, listening to them battling savagely in the woods behind him as he did so. That pretty much matched Fogg's version as well. So, at this point, I was kind of annoyed. I tore into Fogg for telling me to walk up behind a cannibalistic monster without even telling me what it was I was trailing. Then, I tore into both of them for making up stories about living werewolves. Sasquatch we all believed in, but as I said earlier, we all knew there was no such thing as werewolves. At that moment, as if on cue, we heard a long, scary, angry-sounding howl in the woods. It was soon joined by more howls, coming from literally every direction around Fogg's house with the exception of up and down. George called us to the window, and there it was. I saw it with my own 2 eyes, something that I knew did not exist. I saw a reddish, orangish brown furry man with dog legs. It was in Fogg's backyard, but it was not looking up at us. As I watched, it leaned back and howled again for a long, terrifying moment. We all just sat there, silent, with our mouths open as wide as our eyes. That was the most stunning moment of my life, and the most unforgettable too. My wife hates when I place that over our marriage, or our proposal, or the birth of our children, but that's because she didn't see that Dogman howl. And so, on that night, a new idea was added to our neighborhood belief system, and that idea is that there is, in fact, a creature even more feared in the forest than the red Sasquatch, and that creature is what we call the modern American upright walking canine.
It's Monday Night Monsters in color, starring PQ Ribber as Dr. Death, turn out the light, get your popcorn ready, pull up the covers because the doctor is in. Welcome to Monday Night Monsters, the show where you get a Dogman story plus a second story about a different cryptid. Before getting to that, here's an all-new Dogman story, and it's called
The Dunce Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid, I was a fan of the Michigan Dogman and the Wisconsin Werewolf, but I figured I would never see them in real life because I lived in Pennsylvania. It only took a few years for me to be proven wrong, as I saw with my own eyes. The Dunce Dogman. Now, first of all, the name was given to the creature by my buddy we can call Brad, who was sitting in my passenger seat when all this happened. It did not actually happen in Dunstown, though. That was where we were driving south to. That was our ultimate destination. But this all happened miles north of that town, as we were driving down Route 664. The area north of Swissdale and Dunstown is actually a state gaming land, and it's surrounded by other natural areas around it. Although the idea of an animal such as a dogman living in suburban Dunstown is somewhat laughable and absurd, the idea of an unknown large predator living in the huge swath of wild area to the north is at least slightly more plausible, even to a skeptic. But I admit, I'm not a skeptic. I really wanted to believe the Dogman was real, like Mulder wants to believe in UFOs. Keep that in mind as you hear what happened, because maybe I'm not being scientific in my approach to all this. Maybe I just made it happen in my mind. For that reason, I should remind you that my friend Brad was in the passenger seat. I'll tell you where I agree with his report, and where I perceived what happened differently. It was dark out that night, but it wasn't so dark that we couldn't see. Maybe there was a full moon, or maybe our headlights just lit the locations we needed by chance. I can't remember. But it sure seemed as though we were witnessing the following fairly clearly, in spite of the darkness of that night. As we came around a corner in the heavily forested region, we saw directly in front of us on the road a man wearing a backpack. We saw him in profile, and we saw that he was not noticing us approach. He was far more interested in something happening out of our view to our right. I beeped the horn and I hit the brake, slowing the car down as quickly as I could. The guy turned to see us finally, and then he turned around and ran off the road to our left into the trees where we could no longer see him. I sighed in relief and put my foot back on the gas, accelerating the vehicle. At that moment, the most shocking thing that ever happened in my life occurred. From the brush on the right burst something so large that at first I thought it was an overweight horse. Brad screamed, "Dogman!" at me before I could turn my eyes to actually see what that immense thing was that was barreling out onto the road. When my eyes did meet it, I also saw what I would call a dogman. How much of that was influenced by Brad saying the word while I only had the beast in my peripheral vision, I will never know. I have to mention that the creature did not look like what I would have expected a dogman to be. It was much wider and taller than I had thought, and more like a gorilla than a dog in terms of body shape. The head was not that of a gorilla though, nor that of a Sasquatch. Although the body was colored like a silverback gorilla and was twice the size, the head was like a dog. It's not impossible that this might have been some kind of unknown species of dog-like bear. But it was not a typical black bear. It was too large for one thing, and its hands had thumbs, which a bear's do not. In most of the Dogman stories I've read or heard, the monster stands up tall and walks like a human. In this one, he ran, bent over, essentially running on its hind legs, but bent forward and moving as quickly as it could, apparently chasing the man wearing the backpack. Brad insists the thing ran like a gorilla, that its long front arms would hit the ground and propel it more quickly forward. I did not notice the front arms doing this and perceived it as running bipedally. In either case, we only saw it for a few seconds, as I had just foolishly hit the gas one moment before its emergence from the foliage. I had to swerve to my right to avoid smashing into it. I have little doubt that we would have been hurt far worse by such a collision than it would have been. We skidded sideways off the road to the right, and I desperately swung us back around to the left. We spun around more than one time, but somehow ended up back on the highway at the end of it, with both of us screaming like children through the entire episode. I gunned the gas and sped away from there with both of us shouting curse words at the top of our lungs and incapable of calming down until we were miles away. We both felt bad for that backpack guy, but there was no way we were going to go back there to try to help him. That monster was too much even for two guys to handle. It didn't really occur to me till the next morning that I was able to scratch something off my bucket list. I didn't care as much anymore once it had happened. It turned out to be scarier and far more traumatic than I had anticipated being, and I was in a bad way for a few weeks after the sighting. It turned out it wasn't as much fun as I thought it would be to lay my eyes on the Dunce Dogman.
Don't go anywhere. We've got an all-new story about one of the world's strangest cryptids coming up right after this.
And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying new Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story.
We're back. I'm Dr. Death, here again, deep underground, floating down my old stomping grounds, the river Styx. Are you ready to find out what this week's second cryptid is going to be? Just let the old doctor reach in and pull out this week's winner. Ah, the water is nice and warm today. Okay, I'm pulling out the card with the name of this week's cryptid. What does it say? I can't read it.
The Wickerton Wampir. I'm going to tell you a story that my wife wants me to stop telling. It happened before I met her, and it disturbs her greatly. I'm not sure if she is upset about the terrifying reality this story presents, or if it makes her wonder about my sanity. But in either case, I can't tell it in her presence any longer. Neither of us are likely to have much more time on this planet, so there's no point in talking about stuff that'll make the other one unhappy. Especially this kind of story, which features a kind of mythological monster. that isn't supposed to exist. I met and married my wife when we were both in our early 30s, and that was over 40 years ago now. But this story happened when I was 23 and engaged to marry a very different woman, a woman from a well-off German family that I learned too late was cursed. Let's call my former fiancée Ingrid. When I first proposed to her, both her family and mine were overjoyed. I was not rich, but I was an industrious and young man, so everyone saw us as having a bright future ahead. There came a night, though, when the entire town was awakened by the church's bells ringing. The entire town, that is, except our pastor, who slept through the entire affair and didn't know what people were so unhappy about the following morning. That bell ringing was the talk of the town that day, as everyone wondered who had done it and why. Local teenagers were regarded with scorn and suspicion by the adults, but they had been rudely awakened by the sounds just the same as everybody else. What nobody understood that day was that the ringing of those bells was a turning point in the fate of that entire family that I had been planning on marrying into. The following day, I was at their home when an unexpected visitor named Cronkite arrived, claiming to be a distant relative from Saxony. The elderly man was quite spry and chipper as he was let in and brought into the study for some brandy and conversation. I never saw a man behaving so charmingly, yet exuding no warmth whatsoever. Even though every single action he took was agreeable, there was somehow still nothing likable about him. He was not attractive, but I had already known far less appealing-looking older people who I still felt warmth toward and from. This man, if he truly was a man, seemed more like a puppet of a human, with the strings being pulled by some kind of soulless imitation of the life force. He was more of an it than a he, more of a creature than a person, and yet he had done nothing wrong, and we all forced smiles and laughed politely at his clever yet empty joking. He smiled continually, and yet something about even that was unnerving. At points, it seemed more of a display of his large, healthy teeth than a real smile. Cronkite slept over, as did I, and at breakfast the following morning, he asked if he could visit again the following Monday. We accepted out of politeness, but I know that at least I was already wondering if I could be somewhere else the next week. I felt bad about not liking the old man, as he had been nothing but polite and jovial around us, and yet I had an already deep distaste for the very idea of his presence. Ingrid felt weak and ill all that week, and her mother was moving a bit slower than usual too. They both assumed that there must be a flu going around and tried to get a bit more sleep for a few days. When I visited the family after church the following Sunday, both ladies were nearly back to normal, and we all had a fine day, enjoying each other's company. I was invited to stay over with cousin Cronkite the following night. Since we had such fun that weekend, and since I loved Ingrid so deeply, I accepted the invitation. After a week, I had nearly forgotten how little I cared for their elderly cousin. We all went to bed and were awakened once again in the middle of the night by the sound of the local church's bells ringing wildly. The next night, I remembered everything wrong about cousin Cronkite. There was something oppressive about the atmosphere itself when that old man was in the house. It was true that he smiled and joked, but I noticed this week that he was the only one doing so. The rest smiled weakly at his joking, but seemed dispirited or drained somehow when he was around. At breakfast on Tuesday, my fiance's entire family looked ill, even her father. Her brother had rings under his eyes. Our mother could barely keep her eyes open. Cousin Cronkite, though, he seemed unfazed and regaled us all with stories of his adventures as a younger man. He, in fact, looked somewhat younger in the morning than he had the night before. In fact, each time I saw him, he seemed in better spirits, while those around him sunk into weakness and unhappiness. That next week, Ingrid, her mother, her father, and her brother all stayed in bed, and the doctor they had summoned could find no cause for what was happening. He told them to get bed rest and gave them something to make them sleep. Needless to say, my concern was growing daily. By the weekend, they all had made a bit of a rebound, although none of them looked really well to me at all. I insisted they cancel the visit from their cousin Cronkite on Monday, but they all poo-pooed my idea and even insinuated that I was overstepping my boundaries socially by even suggesting such a thing. I was told that if I didn't care for Cronkite's company, I could spend the night elsewhere. So I quieted down externally, but a plan began hatching inside my mind. Once again, we were all awakened after midnight that Sunday night by the bells ringing in the church. I had a view of the bell tower from my bedroom, but was able to make out no detail in the darkness. Somehow, though, that seemed to be part of this mystery, so I ran out, in my bedclothes, to the church. Whoever was ringing the bells, I wanted to see them with my own eyes. By the time I reached the church, panting for air, the ringing had finished for some time. I saw a figure running out of the church's side door and down the block. I immediately thought, viewing the figure from behind, that it was my fiance's cousin Cronkite. But I saw the figure leap a fence and disappear from my view, and there was no way a man as old as Cronkite would have been able to pull off such a feat of athleticism. Out of breath, and with the trail lost, I headed back home, no closer to understanding the mystery of the bell tower than before. In fact, if anything, I understood less about all of this than I had when I was back in bed to start with. Something inside me kept saying this is all part of the same thing, though. It all started at the same time, and in my gut, I was nearly certain that they had to be at least partially related to each other. The next night at Ingrid's home with cousin Cronkite was the most appalling night of my life. Everyone at the table was pale, other than myself and our Saxon guest. He looked like a man in his 40s other than his bald head. He continued to smile constantly, but the smile had taken on a cruel nature. His eyes no longer twinkled, and his brow remained angry-looking, no matter the context. His attitude had grown more condescending, and he was now domineering and rude toward the servants. It was easier to dislike him now, and this gave me extra courage to attempt to carry out my somewhat brazen plan. I was sleeping in the room across the hall from cousin Cronkite, or at least I was supposed to. In fact, that night, I remained by my front door with it slightly ajar. I had my room in pitch darkness, and I spied out the front door into the hallway. I knew that Cronkite was doing something in the night on each of his visits, and I had decided to find out what. I nearly nodded off when I heard the sound of a door clicking open quietly. Looking up, I saw Cronkite leaving his room and heading toward Ingrid's. From behind, he certainly looked to me just like the figure that had run from the church the night before. I watched as Cronkite opened Ingrid's door and walked inside, leaving the door slightly open behind him. Quietly, stealthily, I tiptoed into the hallway, sneaking over to where I could peer inside Ingrid's room. What I saw surprised me so much that I let out a loud cry. There, in Ingrid's room, standing by her bed, was a dark figure, but it was not Cousin Cronkite. In fact, it was not even a man. It was some kind of a thing with a pig-like face, and it was doing something evil. It was not touching Ingrid, but her sleeping body reacted to each of its movements as though it were. The thing turned and looked at me, and the emptiness in its eyes somehow twisted my world and my mind in knots. I remember screaming in horror, unable to form words because I was so in shock over what was happening in front of me. I was in the hallway looking in, and then, instead, I was standing where the creature had stood, inside Ingrid's room. The family and servants rushed in, drawn by my shouting, and found me in Ingrid's bedroom inappropriately. Ingrid herself was recoiling in horror at my presence and my shouting and crying. I was lectured by her father and told to get out that very moment. I tried to object, but found myself too stunned to be articulate. As I left the back door of the home in shame, I heard that pig man laughing behind me. I was never allowed in Ingrid's family home again, but it didn't matter anymore anyway. It was too late, and all 4 members of the family were gone within a year. They all passed from the unknown mystery illness, and Cousin Cronkite returned to Saxony, according to what I heard from one of the former servants years later. Memories of Ingrid are particularly painful for me, as she passed thinking me some kind of insane enemy of hers, instead of the man who loved her, and that's who I actually was. There are legends in Germany, it turns out, of pig vampires who only drain the energy of their own family members. Perhaps, if those legends are true, then that was what Cronkite was. Possibly, he really was related to Ingrid and the others. Maybe he had run out of family in the old country to drain and came here to America to meet and greet his more distant relatives. In any case, I think you can understand why my wife doesn't like it when I start thinking back on those days. What good can come of it, she asks me. So many parts of the story are painful. No redemption in the end, only suffering and passing. And all because of the Wickerton Wampir.
It's Monday Night Monsters in color. The doctor is in. I'm Dr. Death, doing my best PQ River impersonation. Welcome to Monday Night Monsters, the show where you get a Dogman story plus a second story about a different cryptid. But first, here's another all-new Dogman story, and it's the one we like to call
The Dandridge Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I grew up in Dandridge, Tennessee, and I saw Dogman twice while I was there. Well, to be honest, I only sensed him the first time. Although both things happened in two somewhat distant locations, I'm certain it was the same creature both times. You see, I had a slight psychic link to the monster. I don't mean I could read its mind, but there was some slight awareness of each other's presence both times we were close to each other. I don't know how else to explain it besides that. The first time something happened, I was with two friends we can call Rob and Lee. We were walking back to my house in town, or my parents' house, and we were walking past this wild area up there. I suddenly started talking about the large man-beast in the woods. Rob and Lee looked at me as though I were joking. When they realized I wasn't, they looked at me as though I were crazy. I'm not crazy, I told them. It's just that there is a large, intelligent beast in the woods, and it's sharing consciousness with me right now, somehow. At that comment, the two of them seemed to become disturbed with my narration, and they both looked scared. Rob asked me to stop, and Lee looked like he was going to cry. The impressions in my head didn't stop, though. I can run faster than you. I'm larger than you. I'm the most feared of everyone in the forest, I informed them, then clarified that I was speaking on behalf of the forest beast. Dude, you're freaking us out, said Lee. What are you, channeling Bigfoot or something? That was a good question. Was I channeling Bigfoot? I thought about it. I asked the universe, and I asked the beast's consciousness itself. I understood at once that it was not a Sasquatch I was channeling, and it was not a man. It was a dog, but it was the king of all dogs. It was taller than the tallest man, and it was letting me see through its eyes. I could look down to the ground, and it was further away than the eye level of any human should be. In my mind's eye, I walked to the edge of a pond and looked in the reflection of the calm, still water. I was a dog. I was a canine-headed, yet bipedal man. At the same time, I was in no way a man in the conventional sense. It's a Dogman, I said incredulously as my eyes popped open wide, breaking the connection. I found goosebumps rising over my entire body, and I stuttered as I told my friends that we should run. And we did. We ran home that night, and that was the end of my spell, my feeling as though I had joined consciousness with an actual, living monster. But it was only the beginning of Rob and Lee making fun of me about it. They called me Dog Boy. They would sneak up behind me, then make loud barking sounds to scare me. They would leave gift-wrapped boxes on my doorstep addressed to me, containing milk-bone dog biscuits inside. It was so funny to them that I had a strange experience, and they drove me away from them with their harsh mockery. After a while, I just stopped calling them or hanging out with them at all. I didn't really replace them with other friends since it was the summer, and I just stayed in my room and worked on my summer reading list of books. I never did get through more than 1 or 2 books in any summer, but that year I at least tried to do better. So one day, Rob came over to visit unannounced, and he wasn't acting all rude and mean as usual. He seemed kind of quiet, in fact. Eventually, he told me that he and Lee had a bit of an argument. He claimed he was defending me and saying that they should both stop picking on me about that Dogman thing. Eventually, They got in a big fight, and Lee told him to decide between him or me. So he had chosen me. I asked if I was supposed to be honored or insulted and went back to reading my book. The radio we had on in my room began sounding really messed up, and I tried to tune in the station better. While I did so, a voice started coming through that sounded different, yet familiar. It was telling me to meet it at the crack in the woods. It said my name and told me to meet it at the crack in the woods. It told me tonight was the night to meet it at the crack in the woods at 9 p.m. sharp. Then the voice went away and the radio station came back on. I asked Rob if he had heard that, and he asked me what I was talking about. He said the radio sounded fine and there had been no interruption. I told him I had gotten a second message from the Dogman and that he had told me to meet him at the crack in the woods. I guess I better explain what I'm talking about when I say the crack in the woods. In Dandridge Municipal Park, there is a kind of forested island, and it curves in on itself in places. One area where the beach folds up into the woods was dubbed the crack in the woods by us years earlier. Now, if you're wondering how the Dogman would know our private name for this place, I wasn't at the time sure that he did. Since Rob didn't hear the transmission, it might have only been happening in my head. If that was the case, then it probably wasn't even actually words I was hearing, but thoughts and ideas instead, which I must have retranslated back into words. At least that's what I was thinking at the time. That night, I had an appointment with the Dogman, and I was going to make it for one reason, and one reason alone. I wanted to get a photo of that creature to prove to everyone once and for all that this was something real and not something I was just imagining. Rob walked me to town to buy film for my dad's 35mm camera. I begged him to come with me to the forest, but he said he was afraid of werewolves and that I should be too. He told me that I was either the bravest kid alive or the stupidest. That night, at 9 p.m., I was there, in the crack in the woods, terrified, shivering, camera hung around my neck, ready for action. I could see and hear nothing. 9:10 came and passed. 9:15, 9:25, 9:30. I was getting cold, and I was kind of too scared to walk through the woods home. Just because the monster hadn't shown up didn't mean I didn't think it was there. I just felt it wasn't revealing itself to me. Not yet, anyway. I heard sounds off in front of me to my left. It sounded like someone trying to make their way through the woods, clumsily. I squinted into the darkness until I saw him. It was Rob. He saw me too, and he looked really scared. It's here, he told me, looking frightened. It's been chasing me. It's just like you said. Before he could finish his sentence, a dark blur flew out of the woods, and then both Rob and that blur had gone, disappeared into the foliage. I ran screaming toward my friend. I needed to save him. The only reason he was there was because of me, and if anything happened to him, it would be my fault entirely. I never ran so hard in my life, and when I reached the bush I had seen them both fall into, I parted the leaves, and I saw Rob and Lee lying on the grass, looking up at me and laughing their butts off. It had been a gag. I was pretty angry, but I wanted to know how they did it. Before they could answer, I remembered that Lee's older brother was a ham radio nut. He must have helped them break in on my radio in my room. Rob had lied when he said he didn't hear the message. And the reason the voice sounded familiar was not that it was the Dogman. It was because it was Lee's older brother. I was done with these guys as friends. I started the long walk home, cutting back through the woods. I was so angry, it overrode my fear. Rob and Lee trailed after me, saying things to mock me and enjoying themselves laughing. I turned around to say something back, and I saw it. I saw the Dogman. I hadn't seen it the last time, only sensed it. I had that same sense again, and I knew this was the same Dogman. But I didn't take a picture of it, because it wasn't focused on me, not at all. It was watching Rob and Lee. I patiently waited for them to reach a stopping point in their mockery of me. They looked confused, wondering why I wasn't saying anything back. I just calmly pointed toward the Dogman, and they calmly turned and looked at him. This was an 8-foot tall, bipedal, dark-haired, drooling, nasty-looking, dog-headed man-like thing, and it seemed to be in a bad mood. It took a step toward the boys, and they screamed like little girls, and they ran. The Dogman was after them. I watched the three run off in the wrong direction to where we all lived. I, on the other hand, walked home the correct way. After all, I was the only one not being chased by a feral, giant predator. And I was the one who was right about the existence of the Dandridge Dogman.
We're about to tell you a cryptid story that will scare your pants off. Right after this. I'd like to take a moment to say that if you have a scary story you'd like to tell us here, you can write Peter at peterbernard.com, or you can call our new Scary Stories hotline number and leave it to us in the form of a voicemail message. It's easy to remember. 804-LESCARY. That's 804-LESCARY, or 804-537-2279. We're back. I'm Dr. Death, here again, deep underground, floating down my old stomping grounds, the river Styx. Are you ready to find out what this week's second cryptid is going to be? Just let the old doctor reach in and pull out this week's winner. The water is nice and warm today. Okay, I'm pulling out the card with the name of this week's cryptid. I'm not sure I know about whatever this is. Let's check it out. Tell us the story, Mr. Narrator Man.
The Curse of the Hidebehind. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I apologize for writing in all caps, but our keyboard is broken here, and we only have this one computer with access to the internet. Your channel is a favorite here because listening to stories soothes us. At least that's what they tell us. I like your stories because of the monsters, and I want to write to tell you my family's monster story. It's a strange one, and I guess you might say tragic as well. You see, I'm the last of my kind. My entire family, down to the final one, has been hunted to extinction by a breed of cryptid monster that we call the Hidebehind. What is the Hidebehind, you might be asking? Well, It's not that thing from Harry Potter. The legend of the real hidebehind goes back way before the 20th century, back before humans of any kind lived here in North America. The hidebehind was here before us, and odds are he'll still be here after us. The hidebehind is a monster, but he's a monster that doesn't like much conflict. He doesn't like to directly confront his problems or his prey. He sneaks up on them, or he waits to ambush them. He always comes up from behind, and he always finishes his job quickly. People who made enemies of the hidebehind go away, and they don't come back. Somehow, my entire family made enemies with them, and the creatures have dealt with us more harshly than the most severe court of law. The story I was told as a boy was that my Uncle Clayton was the one who offended them. He was alleged to have had an accident involving one of the hidebehinds. Something about driving his automobile and then tragedy. He said the thing looked so human. He felt as though he were a murderer. He set the thing aflame and foolishly burned down a whole patch of the woods. He got taken into custody and sentenced to 10 years for arson. When Uncle Clayton got out for good behavior after 6.5 years behind bars, he never made it home. The hidebehind, he was waiting, and he was counting the days. People think the hidebehind is stupid, but he knows. Somehow he knows. I can't tell you how. Maybe he can read minds. Maybe his spidey senses tingle. Maybe the hidebehinds all spy on people's Facebook pages. Honestly, I don't know. But I do know that each time someone from my family was disappeared, they were going to a place that almost nobody knew they would be going to. And in every case, someone or something was waiting for them and knew their every move before they even made it. You may be asking me, what is the hidebehind? But I'm asking you the same question. Maybe if I understood what it was, I could forestall my fate. The curse of the hidebehind was a legend in my family going back before my birth, but it wasn't something my side of the family took seriously until one day when I was in my teens. My cousin Letty came to visit. My father and I welcomed her in, but my mother was against the idea of feeding and entertaining anyone from that side of the family. That was the side that had offended the hidebehinds. My father asked my mother if we were people or hidebehinds. We weren't going to mistreat our own family just because of threats from some supposed monster of the woods. Dad took orders for Chinese from all of us and walked off to buy us some dinner. We never saw him again. Mom was in too much shock to kick Cousin Letty out. And besides, it was too late anyway. Our side of the family had now offended the hidebehinds as well. Letty had seen the monster 2 times, and I believe that was likely 2 more times than any other human. She would tell the stories over and over. The disappearance of her mother and the disappearance of her brother. She would take a good 5 minutes to tell each story, even though she would also stress the brevity of time each took place in. She would tell it slightly differently each time, not altering facts, but remembering different details with each telling. She would either sit staring out the window with a blank expression, Or she would be telling those two stories again. That was all she did during that period I knew her. And when she would finally grow quiet for a while, someone would usually ask her some detail about the hide-behind, and she would launch back into the narrative, starting at the beginning, each and every time. The details are too graphic and too sad to repeat here, but the basic idea is that in both cases, her family member was walking along past a hiding spot. In one case, a large boulder, and in the other case, a big old dead tree trunk. And then something jumped out of hiding behind them after they had already passed. That something slung its arms out to capture them from behind. Even faster than this, the family member in question would be dispatched, broken like a rag doll by the significantly stronger hide-behind. The beast would carry its captured prize away so fast that in neither case did Letty see what direction they departed into. It was nearly like he pressed a button and hit warp speed. It was not a logical thing to see. It did not seem natural. She told me one time that if it were in a movie, she would think it was dumb and impossible, something that couldn't happen in real life. It looked like someone was able to run their film faster and slow hers down, if that made any sense. She felt as though the creature could move faster, yes, but even more than that, while it happened, she felt trapped and forced to move slowly in response. In both cases, she was unable to chase the creature, with it being gone before she could put her foot down. I said to her that all animals are faster than humans, except for maybe turtles and a few other things. She said, no, this wasn't like that. This was her time being slowed, and that hide-behind's reality being sped up. I laughed at her, and I told her there's only one reality. So she went back to not talking for a really long time. One morning, I woke up, and my mother was gone. My cousin said she got taken, but all I knew is that she was missing. Letty said we had to leave, but I said I had to look for my mother. I went into the woods calling for her, searching for her, and I heard my cousin driving away in my mother's car. I knew she wasn't searching for my mother. I knew she was just trying to escape. I knew she was right, and I was wrong, that my mother was gone, and that I wasn't going to find her. I knew I should have probably been in that car too, fleeing and hoping to live another day. But I also knew that Letty and I were both not going to get away anyhow. Anyway, not forever. The thing began following me. I knew it must have already gotten Letty when it began following me. It wasn't trying to ambush me. It was trailing me. It was trying to catch up. That meant I must have been the last one. That meant my family was entirely gone. That meant that once I had been snatched up, then the curse would be finished. It would be fulfilled. It would be over. I looked behind me, and I saw the shadow of something moving from behind one tree to behind another. It was there, and it was coming for me. How did I know it was the hide-behind? I didn't. That's how I knew. Letty said it was so ugly, it would always stick to the shadows. When you saw it, you would scream. So it tried not to let you see it, except in shadow. There was no hope for me. I was being chased by the hidebehind, and I was the last of my kind. I was so sad. I found myself weeping. So sad for myself, crying before anything had even happened to me. I was running as fast as I could, and I was out of breath. I found it impossible to catch my breath. I just needed to run further and faster and harder. I could feel less sane by the second. I could feel more manic and more impatient and more desperate. It was catching up with me. It would inevitably catch up with me. And I would be no more. There would be no ceremony to mark my passing. There would be no memory of me at all. I would just disappear into the air like so many others of my kind. All that everyone in my family had ever done would be like it was never done. We may as well have never been. I tripped over a tree root and fell face forward into the mud. It hurt, and it was one final indignity. Crying, I lifted my head slowly and painfully, gasping for air, and I realized I had fallen down directly in front of the very tall figure of a park ranger. Looking up at him, I went into shock, and my memories ceased for a while. I remember waking up here, but knowing that I had been staying here for a while when I did. It was like becoming a bit more conscious every day until I knew who I was again. Only now I stay inside here and I'm only allowed out in the yard under supervision. I never feel the presence of the hidebehind here. Technically, I seem to be safe now, but they continue to tell me that I am not well. They won't let me leave, not alone or with anyone else either. Someday they might, though, when I'm older and there's no more of my family money left to pay them for holding me here. If they do, though, no matter how many years into the future that happens, I know one thing. The hidebehind will still be waiting for me. Sooner or later, that accursed, ugly thing will catch up to me and disappear me. And once I'm gone, that will end forever. The curse of the hidebehind.
The doctor is in. I'm Dr. Death, doing my best PQ River impersonation. Welcome to Monday Night Monsters, the show where you get a Dogman story plus a second story about a different cryptid. But first, here's another all-new Dogman story, and it's the one we like to call
The Dogman that read my sister's thoughts. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I come from a fairly successful family, but my youngest sister is the hippy-dippy one. She's actually successful too, as she literally owns a shop that sells crystals. I'm not kidding, as much of a cliche as that sounds like. The rest of us have straight and safe jobs that seem just as cliched to our younger sister. At any rate, when she told me matter-of-factly that she had a werewolf-like creature habituated on her property, and that it was spying on her by listening to her thoughts, I just rolled my eyes and suppressed a laugh. If she weren't my sister, I would have thought she was schizo, but because she is my sister, I just took it to be an example of her unique brand of whimsy. When I actually visited her home to humor her, though, I was locked into one of the most frightening and mind-blowing nights of my entire life. Let's call my sister Crystal as her code name in this. Crystal invited me over because my boredom at her tales of Dogman encounters frustrated her. I guess she could tell that I didn't really believe her, and I suppose she wanted to prove it all to me. So, anyway, I had a free night on the same date that she did, and we made it happen. She prepared her guest room for me, and I committed to sitting up to midnight with her, waiting for the Dogman to wander into her neighborhood and start listening in on her inner thoughts. She told me to brace myself in case he read my thoughts as well. Supposedly, the first time it happened to her, she kind of freaked out. I remember her telling me about running around her house, hands pressed to each side of her face, wishing she could reach inside her head and pull the other presence out. I was barely paying attention since what she was talking about was impossible, and I knew I would experience none of that until I suddenly found myself aware of another presence, sort of a second voice in my head. It didn't feel like someone else, though. It felt like another part of me. Have you ever gone back and forth in your head on a particular subject? Should I do this? Should I do that? And then someone answers your question? Well, this was a lot like that, except a bit more vivid. And this voice didn't speak in words, but in concepts. I would experience emotion, or see a vision, or hear a sound that made me feel a certain way. It was communication in that kind of a sense, rather than in verbs and nouns and descriptive labels. A bit more direct than words, and more universal, I would guess. The other presence suggested I look out the window. Again, it was as though I just suddenly felt like doing this. It didn't feel as though someone else were suggesting this to me. I got up and looked out the window, and I saw a monster. It was like something from a horror movie, and even though it had to be over 100 feet away from me, I instantly felt intensely afraid, just illogically and extremely afraid. The creature seemed to grow in some sense as I recognized it, but I don't mean in size exactly. Maybe it grew in presence or reality or solidity. Its eyes glowed as I looked at it in fear. Had they glowed in that first second my eyes fell on it, before my mind began trying to understand what I was witnessing? Or did they only begin glowing as I became afraid? This was something that looked like an animal, but felt like a character in a nightmare or fever dream. It felt real, and yet it felt as though it were inside my head. I looked at my sister, and I felt great empathy for her. She had been trying to describe this to me, and I hadn't taken her seriously. I wondered if it were the same for her, or if the monster treated her differently. For instance, she knew at once it was a presence outside of herself, while I at first presumed it to be a part of myself. If it hadn't voluntarily given itself up, if it hadn't called me to the window, I might still be living in my presumptive reality. That doesn't mean that this new reality was 100% real either, though. For one thing, there was a werewolf standing outside the window. How real can the world be when you got that going on? And yet, it was the two of us seeing this, so that must count for at least some kind of reality or another. Maybe. I know some people want to know specifically what the creature looked like, so I will attempt to describe it, even though I don't really know if I'm describing a real animal or some sort of hallucination or figment of the collective imagination. It was tall and stood bipedally like a man. It was covered in fur that appeared to be a tan-brown color in the undercoat, but the tips of the fur were black in some places and white in others. It panted like a dog, but otherwise seemed to exhibit intelligence. People ask me if it had hands or paws, and I don't really remember if I saw that. The only time I remember its arms being clearly visible to me, it seemed to be leaning on a branch that blocked my view of its paws. I do know that the legs were like dog's legs. They appear to be taller and stronger than your pet pooch, but more canine than human or primate in shape. They did seem to end in paws, but I never actually saw the feet. I feel as though it had large paws with long claws, but I don't feel it had opposable thumbs or hands. That's just my gut feeling. I have no memory of a tail, but that doesn't mean it didn't have one. I was viewing it from some distance, and it was moving back and forth, hiding behind different trees and branches. To be clear, at that moment I recognized that my sister's experience was real, but I also felt that her description of the experience was a kind of a personal poetry. Since there were no direct words to describe this sort of thing, she was speaking artfully and dancing around the central meaning, hoping to point it out by inference and signposts. On top of that, our nervous systems were reacting differently to what was happening, and it's possible that the experience was individualized and not identical between the two of us. I pitied my sister living there, and I felt happy inside that I had the ability to go home anytime I wanted to. In fact, I wanted to go home right then, and as my mind began to arrange itself around that idea, I would invite my sister to leave with me and help her find a new place to live. I was already thinking about the next day and the next and the next when I suddenly had a vision of the Dogman blocking my path to my car. A jolt of fear shot through me, and I looked out the window to where the creature had been. I could no longer see it there. I felt certain that it was already in place somewhere out there, prepared to block my ability to get into my car and get myself and my sister to safety. It was telling me that I was going to be there for the full night, and grudgingly, I had to accept this reality. "It's frustrating," she asked me, "isn't it?" She had accepted that this thing was going to stand outside, fishing through her memories and feelings for as long as it wanted, and she wasn't free to leave. My will hadn't been broken down over time like hers had, so I resisted everything about this situation. I suggested we try going up to the attic and test the Dogman's range. She just laughed at me. "Psychic powers can work on other planets and forward and backward in time," she insisted. I asked, if that were so, then why was that thing lurking outside the house? Why wasn't it off in a cave someplace, reading our minds from there? No answer from Crystal to that question. We both sat quietly, and the thing walked outside brazenly on the gravel in the driveway. It didn't even care if we knew where it was. It felt that overconfident. I asked Crystal, "Why do you think it's doing this?" The question caught her by surprise, and she asked me what I meant by it. I elaborated, explaining that a normal wolf would need to be spending its time hunting so it could eat, so it could survive to hunt again. It wouldn't have time to spend outside some lady's house at night, creeping about. So, what did it get from doing this? Crystal's eyes widened. "It's feeding off us," she said, then immediately corrected herself. "Well, it's feeding off our emotions." She was right. It was one of those things you couldn't see before it was said, but once it had been spoken, you understood deeply that it had to be true. The thing was feeding off our emotions. That gave me an idea, and I decided to allow myself to experience fear. After all, there was a very powerful predatory monster outside, and the two of us were clearly in great danger. I just let myself feel that fear. I wallowed in it, feeding the monster outside. While the Dogman gorged himself on my fear, I wrote a note to Crystal on a piece of paper, trying to focus on my fear as I wrote, not on the message being written down. Crystal looked at the paper which read, "Focus on your fear." When she read it, and our eyes met, I handed her a second message reading, "When I signal, go out front and run to the car." She nodded and went to stand inside the front door. From her expression, I saw she was focusing on the fear to block her thinking from the beast outside. I walked up to the back door of the house and I opened it. Then I took a step outside, bringing all my fear with me. The gravity of the situation overwhelmed me, and I found myself openly weeping. I felt the Dogman's growing interest, and I could sense it approaching. I allowed myself to feel the most intense sadness I had ever felt. I saw what this creature had already done to my sister, and I imagined how much worse it could make things for both of us. I wept for the pointlessness and futility of it all. Wiping my eyes and trying to compose myself, I looked up and I saw it. The thing with glowing eyes. It was there, at the tree line, closer than it had been to me earlier. Looking at it froze me with fear. I made the mistake of locking eyes, and it felt as though the thing was pulling me outside of myself through my skull. I had to hold on, to cling to sanity and reality. I couldn't remember who I was at points, and I didn't remember what I was doing there. I felt as though I was being pulled inside out by a vacuum, and I couldn't remember what anything was. It was like passing out and achieving ultimate consciousness, both at the same time. Crystal called my name, and I heard a popping sound as I remembered I was supposed to signal her to run, which I did, and then I ran through the house after her. We slid into my car and drove out of there, with the Dogman still faked out in our backyard. I never returned to my sister's place. She did move out, but not for over a year after that. I don't know how she could stand it for that long. The intense fear that the thing brings with it is almost too much to take. You can understand consciously that it's only doing this to feed off of you, but that doesn't make it any less frightening. It's just as scary either way. Crystal and I both have theories about what exactly that thing was. I wonder if it really had anything to do with a wolf at all. I think it just appears that way to seem more frightening. Crystal agrees that it tries to appear as scary as it can, but it does in fact at base have a wolf-like soul. Either way, I hope I never again encounter anything like the Dogman that read my sister's thoughts.
We're about to tell you a cryptid story that will scare your pants off. Right after this.
And now, get ready for an all-new, completely uncensored, slightly bloody, and absolutely terrifying New Dogman story. Oh, wait. YouTube won't allow me to tell you stories like that on this channel. If you want to hear that, you're going to have to go to peterbernard.com and sign up for our paid subscribers club. You can choose any price you can afford for a 1-month subscription, and then every weekend, we tell you a story YouTube would never allow us to tell you on this channel. See you this Sunday for an all-new, very scary, completely uncensored Dogman story. UFO or sleep paralysis. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had an experience which continues to haunt me to this day, even though I can't be certain what exactly happened. This was when I was a senior in high school and still living with my parents. I have never had a similar experience since then, but deep inside, I honestly do expect it to happen again to me someday. Imagine waking up in your bed because you feel as though you're being stared at. Then, imagine opening your eyes and seeing someone right there, leaning over you. Imagine how you would scream. But imagine that you can't. You can't scream. You can't get away. You can't move your arms or legs. All you can do is stare up at the evil-looking face staring back down at you. It seemed like a Halloween mask, except that it was too detailed with imperfections. This was either a real living being or an intense dream image, as I was never so scared before or since. I honestly do believe that beauty is in individuality, but something about this individual's beauty manifested in a completely diabolical way. It just seemed to have evil intentions for me. It gave off the vibe of being the bad guy in the movie that you just woke up in the middle of. My first thoughts were not about space aliens, as the face was hideous, but not like a typical gray alien. I felt myself rising out of my bed and heading toward my ceiling, and it felt very weird in my belly as this happened, sort of a tickling sensation. I was surprised to go right through the ceiling and up into the sky, where there was a vast city floating up there. A lot of the rest of the story is about the same as the stories of a whole lot of other people. I get very emotional when I go through the details, whereas most people only remember their abductions after being hypnotized to remember later. I was fully awake through the entire experience, which was extraordinarily uncomfortable. I remember them removing my outer garments and then going to town doing the alien experimentation thing on me. Very much the same story you've already heard a million times by now. I passed out from exhaustion toward the end, but I have enough nightmare memories from that one night to last 7 lifetimes. When I woke up, the sun was up and I was in my bed. I looked at my alarm clock and it was almost 8, so I went downstairs for breakfast. My mother back then would make breakfast at 8 a.m. on Sundays, and I usually went down at 7:30 to help her. As I walked down to the ground floor where the kitchen was, my family pointed at me and laughed. They asked me if I had a wild night. That question freaked me out a little, and I wondered for a second if I might still be dreaming. They clarified that they were talking about my pajamas. I looked down and I saw that my pajama top was on backwards. Was the dream real? Had the aliens dressed me incorrectly before placing me back in my bed? Then, my mother asked me the weirdest question. She wanted to know where I was earlier. Again, I was kind of shocked at the question. I wanted to know what she meant by that. She explained that she had gone into my room earlier to wake me up for breakfast, and I wasn't anywhere to be seen. So she was just asking where I was in an innocent way. I thought about it for a minute, and I felt my heart beating very hard in my chest. Eventually, I looked her in the eye, and I just told her the truth. I don't know, Mom. I really just don't know. So, what happened to me? I don't know the answer to that either. Maybe if you do, then you can tell me.
I told you it was gonna be strange. Just like we are every week here on Monday Night Monsters. Come back tomorrow when either Bigfoot or Henry Lee Dogman are hosting a new episode of Daily Dogman. And don't forget to check out Nancy Livonian on Werewolf Wednesdays. All these shows and more right here on the Scary Stories NYC channel.
If you enjoyed this, please click like or consider subscribing. Remember to click the bell icon or you won't get notifications. If you want to listen to Bigfoot's secret uncensored story each Sunday, just go to peterbernard.com and become a paid subscriber. See you tomorrow. Same dog time, same dog channel.
Come back for more scary stories.